the presentation today. We are very happy to welcome Professor John Greenwood, who is a professor of philosophy and professor of psychology at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Prof. John Greenwood works in history and philosophy of social and psychological science, history and philosophy of psychopathology and moral psychology. And he's the author of numerous papers and numerous monographs on notably the history of psychology. He wrote The Disappearance of the Social in American Social Psychology, published in 2004 at Cambridge University Press, as well as a conceptual history of psychology, exploring the tangled web at Cambridge University Press in 2015. And currently he is working also on a monograph on the conceptual history of psychopathology. So stay tuned for that. Among numerous papers, two recent of them in 2020 on two foundational principles of the Berlin School of Gestalt Psychology. And in 2019, social cognition, social neuroscience, and evolutionary social psychology, What's Missing, published in the Journal for the Theory of Social Behavior. Today, John Greenwood is going to talk about etiology, distress and disability, and dysfunction in DSM-3, DSM-5.
Okay, all right. Well, hello everyone. I'm John Greenwood. Thanks to Sarah and Anne-Marie for inviting me to participate in this webinar series, and to all of you for turning up today. I've got to confess, I'm somewhat of an amateur in this area, or a Johnny-come-lately. As Sarah mentioned, my main research and teaching interest for the last 20 years has been in the conceptual history of psychology, and it's only lately I've turned my thoughts to the history of psychopathology. My first exploratory steps in this direction was a course I introduced at the Graduate Center 2 years ago on the philosophy of psychology, which was graced by our own Sarah, who contributed mightily, especially on autism. And I reprised this course in the spring under the rubric of history and philosophy of psychopathology, emphasizing more of the conceptual history. And I started writing some things down about that, of which today's talk is a first beginning. Today's talk is drawn from a really quite long chapter on nosology and the DSM for the monograph I'm planning. So it's just sort of pulled out of that, so it may show signs of it. Okay. I hope the twists in the tale you will find engaging, but you might just find it twisted. But either way, I appreciate the opportunity to present it to you and look forward to your critical feedback. Now, let me just share my screen. Get going. Okay, there we are. Let me just, okay, keep that there. I apologize for the title. It's a really boring title. I couldn't think of anything less boring. Just at the last minute, I thought a better title would be DSM Taking It at Its Word. And you'll see later on why I think that's a better title. Okay, this picture here is actually a Renaissance psychiatrist removing a dysfunction from the brain of a psychiatric patient. Okay, let me go. All right, there are three distinctive features of DSM 3 to 5 that supposedly distinguish them from DSM 1 and DSM 2. DSM 3 to 5 are advertised as atheoretical in nature, in contrast to the psychoanalytically informed DSM 1 and DSM 2. Second, they offered operational definitions of mental disorders in line with the so-called medical model of mental disorders. And finally, distress and/or disability and dysfunction were included in the new definition of mental disorders. Now, today I'm going to suggest to you that DSM-1 and DSM-2 were much less theoretical than is normally supposed, and the DSM 3 to 5 were much more theoretical than is normally supposed. And that they didn't offer operational definitions of mental disorders in line with the, well, DSM 3 to 5 didn't offer operational definitions of mental disorders in line with the so-called medical model of mental disorders, at least as usually understood. And finally, the addition of distress and/or disability and dysfunction created all kinds of peculiar implications and puzzles for the classification and explanation of mental disorders. Okay, so DSM-1, the first edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, published by the American Psychiatric Association in 1952. The precursor of DSM-1 was a statistical manual for the use of the Institutions for the Insane, prepared by the Committee of Statistics of the American Medico-Psychological Association, which became the American Psychiatric Association in 1921, and the Bureau of Statistics of the National Committee of Mental Health, that had been founded by Clifford Beers, who was a bipolar patient who'd written a book, The Mind That Found Itself, in 1908. And he established this committee with Adolf Meyer, the psychiatrist, in 1909. It was prepared for the Census Bureau, who wanted an estimate of the prevalence of mental disorders in the US, and was, built into the census of 1920. Okay, the DSM promoted itself as a successor to the statistical manual and lauded itself as a successor. It was actually more directly based upon what's known as Technical Bulletin Medical 203, okay, prepared by the Armed Services in 1946, adopted shortly afterwards by the Veterans Administration, and then by the Joint Armed Forces, 47, 49 respectively. Now, many psychiatrists working or dealing with psychological trauma during World War II and thereafter were dissatisfied with the categories of the statistical manual, and with the heavy emphasis on organic brain disorder and damage. And indeed, only about 10% of their diagnoses fitted the categories of the statistical manual. And given their perceived success in psychodynamic treatment of veterans. Medical 203, crafted in large part by Brigadier General William Menninger, clearly displayed its psychodynamic orientation. The discrete symptom-based organic categories of the statistical manual were displaced by genetic groupings encompassing maladaptive reactions to traumatic circumstances. So here's a language of Med 203. It's a language of genetic disorders and specific maladaptive reactions. The term disorders use the designation of a genetic group of the specific reactions, or the specific reaction types are being termed reactions. The classifications of the psychoneurosis are based upon the dynamics of the psychopathology. Of necessity, a few terms remain descriptive, that is symptomatic. Okay, and it was held that these reactions were basically of the same nature. They weren't discrete differences between them, they just differed in degree of severity, ranging from neurotic to psychotic and so on. Okay, and this led people to suppose that DSM was heavily infused with psychodynamic and psychoanalytic explanations. So the publication of DSM marked an internal transformation that mirrored the growing dominance of psychodynamic and psychoanalytic psychiatry and the relative weakness of the biological tradition. Okay. Now, it was true that for some categories of DSM-1, it was heavily infused with psychoanalytic explanations. So the psychoneurotic disorders, anxiety may be unconsciously and automatically controlled by the utilization of various psychological defense mechanisms, depression, conversion, displacement, etc., supercharged repressed emotions, and so on and so forth, no doubt under the psychoneurotic disorders. However, With respect to many of the others, what you get is the descriptions of MED3, and DSM-1 is the descriptions of MED3 with the psychoanalytic stuff stripped out. So here's obsessive compulsive reaction. So I'm a bit croaky. My wife decided to clean the oven this morning, so the whole house is infused with cleaning oven smells. Okay, obsessive compulsive reaction. I won't read the first thing, but you've got the emotional charge separate from mainstream of consciousness, patient using the mental mechanism of undoing and so on. All good psychoanalytic stuff, right? Then followed by simply a description of the symptoms. I won't read them, but it's just a straightforward symptom description. Remember the first part, the patient himself, and then the psychoanalysis at the end. Okay, and here's DSM-1, obsessive compulsive reaction. So you got the same description of the neutral symptom, description of the symptoms here, but you don't have the psychoanalytic stuff. What you have is in this reaction, the anxiety is associated with the persistence of unwanted ideas and of repetitive impulses to perform acts which may be considered morbid by the patient. There's nothing specifically psychoanalytic about this. Now, it's not a point original to me. This is made established well by Cooper and Blashfield in a paper of 2016, reevaluating DSM-1. And the same is true for many other categories of DSM-1. I believe Rachel's here today, and so I've got to thank her for that. And one other thing. Okay, one category carried over from Med 203 was a big deal for Med 203 because we're dealing with war veterans. The category of combat exhaustion disorder became a specifier, mere specifier for gross stress reaction in DSM-1. So under conditions of greater unusual stress, a normal personality may utilize established patterns of reaction to deal with overwhelming fear. The patterns of such reactions differ from those of neurosis or psychosis, chiefly with respect to clinical history. And this is the thing to focus on, reversibility of reaction and its transient character. So this is nothing like post-traumatic stress disorder, which isn't easily reversible or isn't of a transient nature. Okay, so exemplified in combat or in the civilian catastrophe, fire, earthquake, explosion, etc. Okay, DSM-2, you've got a lingering psychoanalytic influence. The reaction language is dropped except for transient situational disturbances and behavior disorders of childhood and adolescence. You do get lingering bits, so under schizophrenia paranoid type. In general, the disorder does not manifest the gross personality disorganization of the hebephrenic and catatonic types. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. Perhaps because a patient uses the mechanisms of projection. Not because they do, but perhaps because they do. This is a possibility, hardly heavily infused. Okay, again, combat fatigue was further emasculated in DSM-2, relegated to one of 3 examples of adjustment reaction of adult life. For example, fear associated with military combat and manifested by trembling, running, and hiding. I mean, never mind the flashbacks, the recurrent dreams, all the other stuff we get later on. Okay. Now, another category of Med 203 that was carried over, almost to court into DSM-1 and 2 was sexual deviant, a psychopathetic personality type in Med 203, which included homosexuality, transvestism, pedophilia, fetishism, and sexual sadism, including rape, sex assault, and mutilation. In DSM-1 and 2, they're all included. They're now called sexual deviations, and DSM-1 and 2 added exhibitionism and voyeurism. Now, as you all know, they didn't last through all the editions of DSM-2. Special note, the 7th printing of DSM-2. Since the last printing of this manual, the trustees of the American Psychiatric Association in December 1973 voted to eliminate homosexuality per se, and notice it's just per se, as a mental disorder, and to substitute therefore a new category titled sexual orientation disturbance, later ego-dystonic disorder in DSM-3. Change appears on page 44 of this, the 7th printing. In May 1974, the trustees' decision was upheld by a substantial majority in a referendum of the voting members of the association. But it was a majority, it wasn't that substantial, but that's not going to go there today. This was a product of research suggesting that homosexuality was a product of normal variation in human and animal populations, and also studies, of the supposed differences between homosexuals and so-called normals. There weren't any. The main impetus was actually change was social and political in nature. The Stonewall riots and the protests at the APA, which forced the APA to form an APA subcommittee chaired by Robert Spitzer on should homosexuality be in the APA nomenclature. Well, how do you decide that? How do you decide whether homosexuality is a mental disorder? Well, you need some idea of what counts as a mental disorder, what at least are the necessary conditions or an identifying factor. And after considering various things, the committee decided that they were conditions that regularly caused subjective distress or were associated with generalized impairment in social effectiveness of functioning. Now, of course, that made its way into the DSM-3, as we'll see. But since the committee thought this was the distinctive feature, and since they believed that homosexuality, at least homosexuality per se, didn't regularly cause subjective distress and wasn't associated with generalized impairment in social effectiveness of functioning, they concluded that homosexuality per se was not a mental disorder. Why they didn't go on to the other paraphilias and ask that same question is a good question. In fact, they actually did. They raised it briefly and then completely left it alone. But that's another question. Okay. All right. Spitzer, who chaired that committee, was appointed as chair of the revision of DSM-2, the DSM-3 task force. Okay. And here's a statement of his mission. Whether we like it or not, the issue of defining the boundaries of mental and medical disorder cannot be ignored. Increasingly, there is pressure from the medical profession and psychiatry in particular to define this area of prime responsibility. There certainly were plenty of pressures for the committee to do that. They'll be familiar to you, so I'll just remind you of them. Anti-psychiatry, which claimed that mental illness was not real, but a label used to coerce nonconformists. Serious doubts about the scientific status of psychoanalytic theory and the efficacy of psychoanalytic therapy. The huge challenge from clinical psychology after the war, there was just too many veterans for the psychiatrists to deal with. So the Veterans Administration and the US Health Service created certification programs for clinical and counseling psychologists who soon came to outnumber the psychiatrists. Huge pressure from insurance companies for discrete categories and demonstration of efficacy of treatment. For example, Aetna Blue Cross saying medical insurance should only be asked to cover medical mental disorders. And you got the same thing from Congress who said pretty much the same. But more important, perhaps, disagreements in diagnosis. So people, it's the same people of the same descriptions of people would be diagnosed differently in New York as opposed to London. And within studies of, the efficacy of cognitive behavioral treatment of depression, people disagreed as to whether the people that were studying were depressed or not. Some they found different people depressed and others others. Okay, and this was attributed by clinicians to inadequacies of current definitions of mental disorders, including the overtly broad definitions of DSM-2. And research-oriented psychiatrists demanded increased reliability of diagnosis and clearly demarcated mental disorders. Okay, so we get to DSM-3, 1980. There's two major misconceptions about DSM-3. First is that the diagnostic criteria took the form of positivist operational definitions. And the second was the diagnostic criteria were based upon the so-called medical model. Take the first one first. So here's a bunch of quotations. Their approach replicated the positivistic drive in the behavioral sciences towards operational definitions of concepts. DSM-3 introduced methodological innovations based on the earlier recommendations of Hempel and Stendhal for explicit descriptive criteria and a neutrality with respect to theoretical orientation. DSM-3's revolutionary neo-Kraepelians were dedicated to setting up a research program. Embracing Karl Hempel's logical empiricist agenda, the approach to mental disorders in terms of operational definitions for the purpose of enhancing reliability. So the operational definitions were what was going to enhance reliability. However, the descriptive classifications provided by DSM-3 and generally by DSM-1 and 2 were not operational definitions, at least not in the standard sense avowed by neo-behaviorists, who insisted that all psychological theoretical terms be defined in terms of publicly observable stimuli and behavioral responses, as classically given by Tolman and Hull. The descriptive criteria of DSM-3 and its precursors and descendants do not provide operational definitions of mental disorders in this sense, since although they do include descriptions of observable behavior, they also include multiple descriptions of mental states that must be inferred from behavior or accepted on the basis of the subjective reports of clients. For example, in the case of schizophrenia, disturbances in the content and form of thought and sense of self. In the case of depression, loss of interest or pleasure and feelings of worthlessness or guilt. None of the neo-behaviorists and the originators of operational definition would have recognized these as operational definitions. Although there is a lingering sense important to what's going to come, that they did display some characteristics of operational definitions. Okay, so on to the medical model. It's perfectly clear that Spitzer and his colleagues did believe that mental disorders were medical disorders. They were just a subclass of medical disorders. So here's a paper by Spitzer, Endicott, and Franchi, defining medical and mental disorders for different criteria, and I'll come back to this. But with the help of our colleagues, particularly other members of the task force on nomenclature and statistics, we eventually came to believe that mental disorders should be defined as merely a subset of medical disorder. Now, in this matter, they were outvoted by the full committee, DSM committee. Okay, the DSM diagnostic criteria were not instantiations of the medical model as usually understood, as proposing underlying biological pathologies and etiologies. So normal examples of the medical model, you've got bacterial pneumonia, bacterial cause, the lung pathology, explains the symptoms, responds to treatment, and so on. And the pneumonia is the lung pathology. And, you know, the great psychiatric achievement of the late 19th century, the identification of general paresis of the insane as meningoencephalitis caused by syphilitic infection, explaining the symptoms, again, responding to certain forms of treatment. And it's the meningoencephalitis that is the general paresis of the insane. The real difference between DSM-3 and its precursors was in the level of specificity in the diagnostic criteria, which aimed to provide, sometimes disjunctively, necessary and sufficient conditions for the presence of any particular mental disorder, including the absence of conditions indicative of a different mental disorder, plus minimum duration. Okay, in developing these criteria, Spitzer and his colleagues consulted with colleagues at the research-orientated Department of Psychiatry, Washington University at St. Louis, headed by Eli Robbins and Samuel Gauss, who had been developing diagnostic categories of this rigorous nature. John Feichner, who was a member of the department, along with his colleagues, developed 14 diagnostic categories based upon such specific criteria. And this Feichner et al. Paper of 1972 was the most heavily cited paper of the 1970s. Spitzer, who'd been authorized by the National Institute of Mental Health and funded to create what came to be called research diagnostic criteria, consulted with the people at WashU and their colleagues, and looked at the Feichner criteria and based his research diagnostic criteria on the Feichner criteria. And the Feichner criteria and the research diagnostic criteria became the basis of the categories of DSM-3. That should be DSM-3. Okay. The distinctive feature of the Feichner research diagnostic criteria and the DSM categories was the specification of inclusive and exclusive criteria and minimum duration, the specification of the determinate number of criteria sufficient for diagnosis, at least X number of items out of Y number of items. And these criteria were modeled upon diseases for which the etiology was unknown. Okay, and here I have to thank Rachel Cooper again, Bashfield, who tell a story about how, for example, rheumatoid arthritis. Now they tell an interesting story about people who worked on rheumatoid arthritis and also worked on depression, and there was links to that to the Washington U people, and they make a good case for that. And the point I want to make about this is the isomorphism between the diagnostic criteria for rheumatoid arthritis in this 1957 paper and the Feichner criteria and the research diagnostic criteria and DSM-3. So here's the rheumatoid arthritis paper. I won't read you, but you know, disease such rheumatoid arthritis in which the etiology is unknown. Okay, we need something better. So we're going to classify rheumatoid arthritis in 3 categories: definite, probable, and possible. It's the definite one, of course, you need to look at because that becomes a distinguishing feature. Okay, so for the criteria for definite rheumatoid arthritis, okay, you 5 of the following criteria and a total duration of 6 weeks. So you've got 5 out of 11, and you have the exclusions. Okay. Here's the Feichner criteria for depression. Okay, for diagnosed depression, you need A through C. There is a necessary condition, dysphoric mood, and then again, it's 5 out of 8, and exclusions. There's the research diagnostic criteria, which is very close to DSM, as you can see. It's dysphoric mood and or loss of interest or pleasure, at least 5 out of the 8, minimum duration and exclusions. Well, interesting that D you've got here, impairment of functioning. All right. This explains, of course, why in the DSM, individuals can be diagnosed with the same disorder with little or nothing in common. Now, if you think about rheumatoid arthritis, you get 5 out of what was it, 15, right? So one person could have one of the 5, someone else could have a different 5. So they could both have rheumatoid arthritis with nothing in common. And that's, of course, a feature of the DSM, at least some of the diagnostic categories, that gives grief to those who think that the DSM categories are natural kinds of things. So one individual might qualify for diagnosis of depression, for example, by having the symptoms of depressed mood, significant weight loss, psychomotor agitation, feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt, and recurrent thoughts of death. Whereas another individual might qualify by having the symptoms of markedly diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities, insomnia, fatigue, diminished ability to think or concentrate, and recurrent thoughts of death. So the 2 people are depressed, but all they have in common are recurrent thoughts of death. It's worse than that, because if you take psychomotor agitation or retardation and insomnia or hypersomnia as 2 alternatives, then of course they can have nothing in common. All right. So on to DSM-3. DSM-3 advocates a descriptive approach and a theoretical approach. The approach taken to DSM-3 is atheoretical with regard to etiology or pathophysiological process, pathology, except for those disorders for which this is well established. Okay. Now, they give a perfectly good reason for this, right? They say, well, look, people can agree upon what disorders are, like phobic disorder, but disagree on what the causes, explanation of them are. So, you know, some people think phobic disorder is caused by displacement anxiety during breakdown of defensive operations. Others think it's learned avoidance responses to conditioned anxiety, basic biological systems, the deregulation of basic biological symptoms, different explanations of phobic disorder, but we can all agree on what a phobic disorder is. As the field trials have demonstrated, clinicians can agree on the identification of mental disorders on the basis of their clinical manifestations without agreeing on how the disturbances come about. Okay, however, DSM-3 didn't quite live up to its atheoretical mantra. Couple of no, why is it? Okay. Yeah, okay. So it's just decided to change the way it's going to move from slide to slide. Okay. Now, one notable exception to the atheoretical mantra was the psychosexual disorders. So the name of this diagnostic class emphasizes that psychological factors are assumed to be of major etiological significance in the development of disorders listed here. Not well established, right? They're not well established at all. They're just assumed. And furthermore, it's a psychoanalytic assumption. The very term psychosexual disorders is a Freudian term. Second stark example is the diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder, where the etiology is absolutely clear. The existence of a recognizable stress that would evoke significant symptoms of distress in almost everyone. Now, that might be true, but at the time of DSM-3, that was not well established. Okay, there were no field trials for post-traumatic stress disorder, and much of the pressure for the inclusion of this diagnostic category was veterans associations who quite rightly, justly wanted a diagnostic category that would allow them to get insurance compensation. Now, I'm not knocking this actual diagnosis. I'm just saying that at the time, this was not an established thing. However, this is picky, right? It's just picking in two things that really aren't atheoretical. It's actually much worse than that. Okay, so you get also in DSM. Okay, I think I've got an extra 5 minutes because of the introduction, so according to my timing. The other distinctive feature of DSM-3 and beyond was, of course, the definition of mental disorder. DSM-3, each of the mental disorders is conceptualized as a clinically significant behavioral psychological syndrome or pattern that occurs in an individual and that is typically associated with either a painful symptom, distress, or impairment in one or more important areas of functioning. In addition, there's an inference that there's a behavioral, psychological, or biological dysfunction, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so you get the distress and disability and the biological dysfunction. How are they related to each other? It doesn't actually say in DSM, but in that Spitzer, Endicott, and Franchi paper about the background to the DSM, it's quite clear if you read the paper. And here's what they say. This is deliciously ambiguous. A medical, including mental disorder, is a relatively distinct condition resulting from an organismic dysfunction, which in its fully developed or extreme form is directly and intrinsically associated with distress, disability, or certain other types of disadvantage. So the ambiguity is what is which qualifying in this quote. Okay, if you read on, it's quite clear that they think that the organismic dysfunction causes the condition, which in turn causes the distress and disability and so on. Okay, but distress and or disability were not included as diagnostic criteria for many mental disorders in DSM-3, including depression and schizophrenia. They were included for obsessive compulsive disorder. Here you have it, B, obsessions, compulsions are a significant source of distress, blah, blah, blah. But major depressive episode, you just got the symptoms. It goes on with exclusions, but you don't get distress or disability as any part of the definition. Okay. Now this made it, this had an interesting implication. This made it possible for persons to be diagnosed as depressed or schizophrenic, or indeed to be depressed or schizophrenic without suffering distress or disability. Use your criteria to satisfy them, depressive disorder. This was inconsistent with the general definition of mental disorder, although it actually seems a genuine possibility. It may not be common, but it's certainly analytically coherent, logically possible for someone to be depressed without being distressed or disabled. And in fact, I think I know someone like that. They just think this is the way things are. Okay. But it had a virtue, okay, namely that it enabled clinicians to make the substantive claim that depression and schizophrenia and other things cause distress and disability. Because there's a depression, and the depression causes the distress and disability. Now in DSM-4, clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, and other important areas of functioning were added as diagnostic criteria for many individual disorders, including depression, schizophrenia, and the paraphilias. This had the virtue of rendering the diagnostic criteria consistent with the definition of mental disorder, but it had an awkward implication, because now it was vacuous to claim that depression, schizophrenia, etc., cause distress and or disability if the latter are included in the diagnostic criteria of depression, schizophrenia, etc. If distress and disability are included in the criteria for depression, then you can hardly say depression causes distress and disability. You're just repeating yourself. But that's a bit unfair. That's a bit unfair on depression in particular, because in the case of depression, for example, but it's true of other things, it's the symptoms that cause the clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. So it's the symptoms that cause the distress and impairment, which suggests, as a consequence, it's implied that for disorders such as depression, the symptoms are the depression, which only becomes a depressive disorder when they cause distress and or disability. And this is formalized in the case of the paraphilias in DSM-5. So DSM-5 says, the term paraphilia denotes any intense and persistent sexual interest other than sexual interest in genital stimulation or preparatory fondling with phenotypically normal, physically mature, with A phenomenically, or consenting humans. A paraphilic disorder is a paraphilia that is currently causing distress or impairment to the individual, or a paraphilia whose satisfaction has entailed personal harm or risk of harm to others. A paraphilia is a necessary but not sufficient condition for having a paraphilic disorder, and a paraphilia by itself does not necessarily justify or require clinical intervention. So the paraphilia is the first thing, right? Just as depression is the symptoms, and they only become a disorder if they cause distress and or disability. This gives a lie to the idea, again, gives a lie to the idea that DSM-3 to DSM-5 are atheoretical. It's a different kind of atheoretical, but it's still theoretical. There's a different kind of theoretical, but it's definitely theoretical. But of course, there's more of this. So let's get to the dysfunction, the DSM-5 version that includes. So a mental disorder is a syndrome, etc., that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental functioning. In DSM-3, it's an inference to a dysfunction, and DSM-3R and 4, it's a manifestation of a dysfunction, and DSM-5, it's a reflection. And also at the same time, they say an expectable or culturally approved response to a common stressor or loss, such as the death of a loved one, is not a mental disorder. To both of these, I say, how much more theoretical can you get? Okay, there has to be a dysfunction seen as the cause of the depression or whatever, and it can't be a result of bereavement, loss of someone to loss of your job, and all these other sorts of things. Okay, in any case, dysfunction is a cog that turns no wheels in the diagnostic criteria of DSM 3 to 5. Inferred or manifested or reflective dysfunctions form no part of the diagnostic criteria for individual mental disorders in DSM 3 to DSM 5. Now, this is perhaps not surprising, because if, as Spitzer, Endicott, and Franchi in that paper laying out their ideas about this had earlier suggested, there's no independent criterion for dysfunction, other than the satisfaction of the operational criteria for individual mental disorders, held to be sufficient evidence for an organismic dysfunction. But evidence here is misleading. It's not evidence for some other extra thing, right? Because these are operational criteria. They're not like regular operational definitions, but nevertheless, the content of ascribing a dysfunction is just the same as ascribing the particular disorder, which is given by the symptomology. So the content of ascribing the function is no more than the symptoms, which has a consequence that you can't appeal to distinct dysfunction to explain individual mental disorders, if you accept that operationalization of what both these things are. Okay, close to the end now, Sarah. I know I've got a few minutes over, but slow down. And this is actually suggested by the DSM definition of mental disorder, in a sense. The DSM-4 definition of mental disorder says, whatever its original cause, and that's my emphasis, the mental disorder, must currently be considered a manifestation of a behavioral, psychological, or biological dysfunction in the individual. But this suggests that the dysfunction cannot be, or is unlikely to be, the distinct cause of the mental disorder, since the original cause is not identified with the dysfunction. Although, to be fair to them, this claim is omitted in DSM-5, perhaps for that reason. I don't really know. Now, if the symptoms of a disorder cause the distress and/or disability associated with the disorder, as affirmed by DSM-4 and DSM-5, then these symptoms would appear to be constitutive of the manifested or reflected dysfunction, rendering an inference to a distinct explanatory dysfunction associates. And this makes it natural to suppose then that the symptoms constitute the dysfunction in many cases. And you might be tempted by that. I'm tempted by that, right? I was tempted by that. But there's a problem with that. And one of the problems with that is the paraphilias. Because in the case of paraphilias, there's just no obvious dysfunction if they don't cause distress, disability, or harm to others. I mean, where's the dysfunction? It's just a different sexual orientation. And I think this generalizes to other disorders. You think of depression or schizophrenia, right? If it doesn't cause distress to the individual, it doesn't harm others, it isn't dysfunctional, then, dysfunctional in the social impairment sense, then where's the dysfunction? It's just that they're different from us. So I think that generalizes to other disorders. Now, this is a kind of a conclusion, tentative conclusion, something I've probably thought of before, but it fits here. This is my penultimate conclusion, penultimate point. Perhaps the most reasonable way of interpreting the DSM mental disorders is to treat them as human conditions, whatever their ultimate cause, that regularly cause distress and/or disability, but which do not justify required clinical intervention when they do not. And note, as they might be supposed to do if they constitute breakdowns in evolved functions, a la Jerome Wakefield, or general cognitive, motive, or behavioral function, a la the research domain criteria of recent vintage. Okay, so finally something heretical. Why in any case suppose a unitary cause, dysfunction or otherwise? Okay, now in the discussion of the major depressive disorder in the DSM-5, in the general discussion, you get this point. Responses to a significant loss, e.g. bereavement, financial ruin, losses from a natural disaster, a serious medical illness or disability, may include the feelings of incensed sadness, etc., and so on, noted in criterion A, which may resemble a depressive episode. Although such symptoms may be understandable or considered appropriate to the loss, the presence of a major depressive episode, in addition to the normal response to a significant loss, should also be carefully considered. So maybe depression on top of this, right? But my reaction to that is, it bothers me, but if you take the DSM at its word, if people suffering bereavement or financial ruin or whatever, if they satisfy a sufficient number of the symptoms of depression as specified, right? 5 out of so on, that surely counts as depression, even if the cause is bereavement, financial ruin, suicide of spouse or child, etc. And if the symptoms cause distress, this surely counts as depressive disorder. I mean, you got to bite the bullet if you're really taking, if these are operational criteria, and this is what depression is, and you get the symptoms, you've got depression. Now, there may be reasons you might be hesitant to call it depression. That might stigmatize people who are bereaved and so on. And you shouldn't rush to medicalization. That's another good reason. But I don't think there's any good reason for not recognizing it as depression, at least according to the DSM. And that's why I'm saying I'm taking the DSM at its word. I'm not saying this is the case, but if you accept the DSM at its word, I think you are bound to accept that. So my final thing is, what's wrong with bereavement, financial ruin, suicide of spouse or child, etc., as a theoretical etiology for a good number of DSM disorders? Okay, well, here's my references, and thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your talk, John Greenwood. So we're gonna have time for the Q&A now. So if you have any question, just write it down in the chat, or I mean, just write down in the chat that you have a question, and you're going to be able to ask it to John Greenwood.
Okay.
Yeah, so Miriam Solomon has a question.
Hello, Miriam.
Hi, everyone. Hi, John. Nice to see you. So I'm wondering whether you're a little bit hard on the DSM. And while there are many things to object to in the DSM, here's an alternative framing of concepts like operational and atheoretical that might be a little more generous to the DSM. I mean, by the time DSM-3 is written, we're not in behaviorism anymore. And what the DSM-3 was really concerned with was reliability of diagnosis. So asking a patient whether they felt guilty or asking them other things to try to invoke guilt if it was there, while not a behaviorist measure, was appropriate for the goals of DSM-3.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing I'm thinking is what atheoretical means. And again, you know, atheoretical in the 1930s might have meant something very different from atheoretical in the 1970s and the 50s. So, you know, by the time we're getting to 1980, nobody's talking about being completely theory-free.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the DSM-3 and its successors, what they wanted was to occupy a point where the theoretical differences between, you know, major groups of clinicians were not at stake. So they would be okay with the idea that there were unquote underlying causes, while neutral about whether the causes were neurological or social or psycho. So the theoretical, there is theory to the DSM, and actually, you know, if pressed, I would say, you know, the theory leans towards the biological psychiatry side, but I think there was a lot of attempt to be neutral about it, and in many cases that succeeded. So, two kind of framing questions.
Well, the first one about the operational definition wasn't actually, the main intention of that wasn't actually to be critical of the DSM, right? It was to be critical of the people who were accusing DSM-3 of giving operational definitions in the classical sense.
Okay.
I mean, because they weren't doing that. That was sort of the main point of that. They do give operational definitions in a looser sense, and that was a point. That was a later point about, you know, you operationally define depression in terms of the symptoms that cause a distress and disability, so that the content of depression is as in classical operational definitions exhausted by those things, as opposed to what some behaviorists called, you know, the surplus content. So the distinguish between intervening variables and hypothetical constructs. So I think the DSM intended their operational definitions to be independent variables exhausted by whatever the symptoms were, rather than something over and above. Except that, of course, they add on the something over above the theoretical thing. And the major theoretical thing is the dysfunction. And as you see, I think that does, and that's why I said at the beginning with that picture, that you're removing the dysfunctions from the brain, because that's where the dysfunction is seen to be. So, and look, I've got a lot of sympathy with the problems people had constructing DSM and so on. And I'm just trying to be coldly analytic about this document and its conceptual history and what the implications are. So I'm completely atheoretical about what the causes of these things are. I just think, you know, they should allow these other causes, because as you said, well, they're sort of, they're more accepting of the theoretical, but they're not. So, you know, bereavement can't cause depression. You know? Substance abuse can cause depression, but bereavement can't.
You're saying can or can't?
Well, they're saying it won't be depression if it's bereavement, unless it's something over and above or doubling or whatever. I don't get what happens when you have the diagnosis of depression as well as bereavement, because you got the same symptomology in both. It's like
I certainly agree with you on that. Yeah,
they both supervene in the same thing. It's just weird. Yeah. Okay, good questions.
Right. The next question is from Justin Garson.
Well, hello, Justin.
Hi, John.
Yeah.
So first I want to apologize because I got really confused about the time and I stumbled in about halfway through your talk. So I'm going to be the guy who asked that annoying question that pretty much asks you to recapitulate what you might have already been talking about. And I apologize if so. But I wonder if some of the inconsistencies that you mentioned with the stem from the fact that, as I see it, the definition that was published in 1980 in the DSM-3 seemed really like a response to various kinds of political and even philosophical projects that had very little to do with the actual, clinical or research context. And so, I would almost, it would be unsurprising to me if there were various inconsistencies. And as I understood it, a big part of the way that the DSM-3 definition was formulated kind of kicked into gear with the debates about homosexuality in the 1970s, early 1970s. And it seemed like after 1973, there was this real push among psychiatrists to get more philosophical about how do you define mental disorder, how you distinguish disorder from sanity or normalcy. And if I remember, Robert Spitzer wrote a lot of these memoirs, kind of what was going on at the time. And if I remember, the whole distress and disability was partly a way of having a definition that excluded homosexuality on the grounds that, hey, if it's not distressing, and if nobody, if you're doing okay at your job and in your home and your love life, then you can't, by definition, have a mental disorder. And then I think maybe dysfunction came in with that 1978 paper you mentioned, almost just as a slogan or a label, just to assert these are legitimate medical conditions. We don't really know what dysfunctions are, but we know that when we use the term dysfunction, it kind of situates our work firmly in the context of medicine. So if you could just, sorry about that, but if you maybe say a little bit about the clash between these kind of political, philosophical ends and the more clinical research.
Well, yes, but I hate to upgrade you for this, Justin, but I did go through the whole AP homosexuality thing and how the committee investigating whether homosexuality was a mental disorder asked themselves what were the distinctive features, and they decided that it was distress and disability, and by that criterion, homosexuals didn't seem to be suffering from a mental disorder because they weren't generally distressed or suffering from a disability. Although notably, so that was one reason why that was built into the definition of mental disorder, because they've been asking themselves exactly that question beforehand. So it didn't spring from nowhere. You're right, it sprung exactly from that kind of conversation. But homosexual per se wasn't disorder, but ego dystonic disorder. So when a homosexual was distressed by their condition or were suffering stuff, then they were suffering from a mental disorder. Now, when Spitzer talks about per se, homosexual per se isn't a disorder, he doesn't think everything's fine, right? And he actually goes on to say in this discussion of this, that this is an open question. To say that homosexuality per se isn't a disorder doesn't mean that homosexuality is okay or a good thing. And I think it seemed to me when I was reading that he clearly thought that homosexuality was dysfunctional in some way, right, in its very nature. So I don't think the inclusion of dysfunction is really very, I don't see any reason for including this dysfunction. And that's my point, right? Because it's clearly it's a causal claim. It's quite clear what they think's going on.
Yeah, let me just clarify that when I said that a lot of these discussions happened in the wake of the controversy I mean, these were themes that had been circulating for a while, but I think it was only in 1973 that there was a kind of an explicit call, let's publish an actual definition of mental disorder. And then it was Spitzer and Donald Klein, and suddenly all of these clinicians started kind of putting on their philosophical hats and working through it in a more analytical way. And, you know, I think they might have kind of made it more explicit as part of their definition and something that they wanted to be published in the manual after that. But I certainly didn't want to say that those themes weren't already part of the discussions.
No, but I think it's perfectly justifiable to include distress and disability, because that does seem to be a distinguishing feature of mental disorders. I just don't think that's true of dysfunction. I think that something that claims avowedly atheoretical to say there must be an inference.
Oh yeah,
that's just out of court, you know.
Yeah, and I thought, sorry, I'm just one more thing, please.
I should say I'm not saying that these disorders aren't actually caused by dysfunction in some cases. In some cases, I believe they are. In some cases, I think they're not, and I know you think that's true as well, and I know your view on that. But to include that in DSM-3 just seemed to be in violation of what it was supposedly presented as.
Yeah, and I guess I'm thinking that I mean, that's clearly a contradiction to say this is an atheoretical, non-etiological, you know, manual, and then include dysfunction there, which is clearly etiological. I just remember from that 1977, 1978, it seemed to me like the whole point was to say mental disorders are a subtype of medical disorder, and it seemed to me that the notion of dysfunction was really used as a kind of almost as like a slogan-esque way to affirm, you know, the medical orientation.
Oh yes, oh yeah. No, I agree. I 100% agree with that. It's almost like a sleight of hand. And that paper that I've been quoting from, the Spitzer and Frenchy one and so on. The only justification they have in that paper for dysfunction, and because they explicitly say we're not talking about an evolutionary dysfunction or anything like that. It's just that this is a feature of medical disorders, and mental disorders are a subset of that. And then they give the criteria of medical and mental together, and the dysfunctions part of it, and the stress and disability. So I agree about the etiology of dysfunction getting into DSM. I just disagree with the justification of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
Good question.
There's a comment in the chat.
Paper discuss the debates of homosexuality.
Yeah, Carolyn, I'm happy to, and I'm sure John has plenty too, but I'm happy to send some references that I know of on some of these debates, and at least mainly Spitzer's recollections of them, which may or may not be entirely accurate.
That would be great. I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
It would be, and I'm going to go back to this myself, because now you raise that question, and I agree with Justin. This was part of the talk, was that distress and disability grew out of the homosexuality thing. But looking, if I go back and look closely at the discussions of distress and disability, is the notion of dysfunction creeping in there, right? I had a sense when Spitzer talks about homosexuality per se, isn't to say it's an okay thing, right? He probably thinks it's dysfunctional in another way, not in generating distress and disability. So that's something. Thank you, Carl. I'm going to probably use that if I can. With due credit to you.
All right. We have another question from Sarah Mangle.
Hello, thank you so much for your talk. I've been spending a lot of time in the last 2 weeks with articles from the Journal of Homosexuality and the Journal of Sex Research looking at how coming out theories stem from this time in the 70s. So as it moves out of the DSM, the push towards a sort of normative self-disclosure. And in looking at the articles before 1973, there really seems to be a distress on the side of the researcher, that they're distressed by homosexuality. And we do see this even into, as you described, even into the 80s, just as you say, like, okay, we're not classifying it per se in the DSM, but we aren't, we're still a little bit, touchy about it. And I'm just wondering, as somebody who's new to scholarship around the DSM, do we see this kind of distress about other disorders, from the side of the clinician, as opposed to witnessing suffering, but actually clinicians or researchers being uncomfortable with iterations of disorder that they're witnessing or that they may want to classify?
Yeah. So I lost my thread on the first part of the question. I was going to respond to that. Your first point was that, oh yeah, so no, I know how I was going to respond. Were clinicians at the time concerned about whether homosexuality was in fact okay? As I was saying, Spitzer seemed to think it was only homosexuality per se. That wasn't saying homosexuality was okay. But remember that when this was first proposed to remove it from DSM-3, the psychoanalysts objected because they thought it was a disorder. And
they objected for 20 years afterwards.
They thought it was a disorder and they thought it was rare. And so it was them that forced the vote of the whole association. And it passed by 66%. It wasn't like 80 or 90.
Yeah.
People make it out as though it was over, by substantial majority. Well, it's getting into substantial range, but it's hardly, about a real validation by the APA that homosexual per se isn't a thing. Now, as to the other things, what do people think about? So do you mean that clinicians are uncomfortable with certain diagnosis as being diagnosis of mental disorders, or?
I mean more, and like this might have no grounds. I'm just sort of floating an idea, and I want to see what you think. But around the homosexuality issue, it really seems like there's a moral and like a normative discomfort with homosexual acts and behavior. And that really seems to be intertwined with, clinical experiences. So there's a shift away, but I'm just wondering if we can apply that to, if there's political or other reasons why that might also be applied to other disorders.
Oh, well, one clear example of that, I think, is where the morality sticks its nose in, is the paraphilias, and in particular pedophilia. Now, one of the things that turns pedophilia into pedophilic disorder is if you act out your urges with a young child. Now that should be criminalized, and all sorts of things you can say about that. But that has no place in a psychiatric diagnosis. I don't see why that is any indication of it. So why isn't rape in there as well? Right? Why isn't? So I think that's only in there for moral reasons. And again, but people raised at the time for all the paraphilias. If it doesn't cause distress or disability, what's wrong with it? And I think DSM-5 sort of recognizes that, but it doesn't go on to say for the other ones, well, it's the same with them. As long as it doesn't cause you, they should say, it should be exactly the same as homosexuality. Now, paraphilias, pedophilias, of course, are slightly different because people are concerned about the consequences of pedophilia. who act out their things. But that's a moral legal issue. It's got nothing to do, I think, with psychiatric diagnosis. And when the other ones don't have distress and disability, there's no business calling disorders. I think that's all moral stuff. I mean, we think we've moved a long way since 1974. We haven't really, in that sense. Yeah.
Right. Sarah, you have a question?
Oh, yeah.
Yes. So I'm a bit curious about what you think then could be or should be in the DSM. So do you recommend that, or would you, or do you think it would be more accurate to have a manual that lists a number of conditions or something like that, and that these conditions are there if there is distress, and if and only if there is distress? So what?
Okay.
What? Yeah.
I see the problem you're pointing at, which I kind of left out of this, because I mean, a distinctive feature of mental disorder being distress and disability, but that's a necessary condition, right? Do you want to make that a sufficient condition? Now, you make it a sufficient condition, you open up the door for all sorts of things. So someone who's shy, for example, someone who's really shy, causes them great distress and disability. Now, I'm very tempted to say that's, you know, a mental disorder. If you have shyness to that degree that it causes distress and disability, then, but you know,
yeah,
it's on the same ontological level as a mental disorder. Now, there's all kinds of reasons why you wouldn't want to call it a mental disorder, because it makes a bad situation worse, right? You're shy, and now someone tells you get a mental disorder. Although, on the other hand, that cuts both ways, because some people might be relieved to find they have a mental disorder, and there's ways of treating it and so on. In fact, early on, it was actually a relief to some homosexuals to be told they had a mental disorder, because then they would say, well, they don't feel so bad about it, because something can be, it's a medical disorder and something can be done about it. But I see the force of your point. That, you know, do you make the stress and disability sufficient? But certainly, but one response would be, well, maybe it's not a regular mental disorder because it's quite rare. But if it causes the same level of distress and disability as any other mental disorder, then it's appropriate to help that patient in the usual sorts of ways. Not necessarily with drugs, but, you know, cognitive behavioral treatment or any other kind of therapy that actually works to relieve the distress and disability.
Yeah, thank you. I just to follow up, I'm sympathetic to the view because I believe that like we tend to essentialize so much that we forget how real society is and make things like still I'm thinking also of the reverse consequence, which is then can we really differentiate between the harm that is caused by society from the distress per se or something like that you were mentioning earlier? And I'm thinking there of all these movements now in activism now that is like, I think echoes some activism that was related to homosexuality, but I think there are differences today. But if you take movements of neurodiversity, or like people defending the fact that autism is a difference and not a disorder, or you know, everything surrounding like deaf communities. And then the idea there is that there is harm and distress that comes from our very neurotypical world and lack of open-mindedness or understanding of differences. So what do we do with these? And should we put more things in the DSM so everyone feels better, as you were saying, because homosexual people, for example, at the time were feeling better to have a disorder, or do we remove these things from the DSM because we want to stop pathologizing everything?
Yeah. Two things I say that. One is, you know, you got to be careful to distinguish between it. Is this caused by or a product of society, right? That makes me feel bad about homosexuality, or is it just come from internal? There's a subtle difference in between, you see, because some people don't have homosexuality is wrong drummed into them, right? Some people just sort of absorb this idea themselves and come to accept it as theirs, right? So not because people are, and they may even keep it secret, right? And they're just wondering about themselves, and they don't like being different from other people. And whatever people say about this is okay and so on, they're uncomfortable about it. They just can't, I mean, they think they think they're alpha males and so on, and they're really uncomfortable with the feelings and so on. So it's, I think it's, and if someone is in that condition with distress and disability, right, that's a bona fide mental disorder by the letter of the DSM. Now the thing about the neurodiversity, I mean, now, some of them might want to be included as having a regular disorder, but I understand a lot of them don't. That's about the point of the neurodiversity. But I think also, you know, not everyone's on board with neurodiversity. Not every blind or deaf person and so on just wants to accept. I'd rather remain blind. I know people wouldn't perfectly well wouldn't remain blind. They would give their eye teeth to see, right? I understand deaf people who've been brought up and so on, how the whole social network and the whole thing, and then the way they language and they think in terms of sign language and so on. I can understand why you wouldn't want to become a hearing person again for that reason, but I don't think everyone's on board with that. I think that's not just because you're neurodiverse doesn't mean you're going to be on board with it. This is the group I identify with. I think that's a very difficult and complicated thing to handle in the present social political situation, the whole thing around DSM. You've got to tread very carefully. I noticed that in the last class I had to be very careful about what I would say about that.
Yeah, thank you.
Right. Is there any other questions? Right. So I think we can thank our speaker of today, John Greenwood. Thank you so much for this great talk and for the great discussion.
Thank you for the great questions. No, it's made me think on a few things, maybe slightly differently. Yeah.
And if you like the event, you're very welcome for our last event for this fall season of the webinar. So our speaker will be Myriam Solomon. And it's going to be on December 9th, but the title will be announced soon. So thank you everybody for being here today, and see you soon.
I'm going to do my best to be at Miriam's talk since she came to mine.